Recently, there was this new remake of a show on Netflix. It's a show that existed in the early 2000s called The Mole. How many of you guys saw the original Mole or have seen the remake? Just a couple people. Man, so sad. But it was one of those shows that was when it was on, I didn't understand why it got canceled. It was like Anderson Cooper was leading it back in the day, and it was just really fascinating show. And the whole premise of this show is it's a reality game show. They get together, they try to complete different tasks, and as they complete tasks, there's actually one person amongst them who is the mole, trying to sabotage the missions. And you spend the whole time trying to figure out, who is this person? Who is the one that is trying to make them lose, basically? And the strategy behind this, I think, becomes more and more interesting as you go along, because the players begin to then see, like, okay, well, after each round, we have to take a quiz, and we have to try to figure out who is the mole. And if I get the lowest score, I get eliminated. So maybe the best strategy that I have is to draw suspicion on myself, to create this narrative that I am the mole, because then if someone else guesses me and they get all these questions wrong, at least I keep getting closer and closer to the end, to the prize. And the mole, sometimes they want them to lose all the money, sometimes they want them to lose a little bit, or sometimes they don't even want. As this was put on Netflix for a couple nights and watched it, and immediately I told my wife after finishing it, I was like, do you want to rewatch this with me? In part because I am a nerd and I like analyzing these types of shows, but also because now I knew who the mole was. See, the first time that I watched through the show, I was like, you spend the whole time creating these narratives and trying to figure out who it is. So maybe it's this person, or that person, or they sabotaged the mission, or maybe they're just incompetent and that's why they lost this mission. But now I know who the mole is, and I can begin to see, I can begin to rewatch through new eyes who this was. I move away from constructing these realities and these narratives about all the players, and instead I see this perspective of this person who's trying to sabotage the game. Today we're continuing on with our series, The Thing Beneath the Thing. And if you've been with us the last few weeks, you may know that this is an acronym that stems from a book by a guy named Steve Carter. In week 1, we talked about this idea of triggers. Week 2, we talked about hideouts. Week 3, we spoke about insecurities. And I would encourage you, if you've missed any of those weeks, go back to YouTube, check those out. It's been a really interesting series and a lot of great content that has been spoken about. And so when we are triggered, as we talked about in the first couple weeks, sometimes we run to our hideouts, the things that where we hide from society, where we can escape the real world. Maybe sometimes we run to our insecurities, we get up in our mind, we begin to convince ourselves of these different realities about ourselves. But today we're going to be talking about the third thing that sometimes we can run to, and that is narratives. Now, narratives in this context, I put a definition of how I would describe it in this particular context. That should be on the screen. It'll say this: narratives evolve from taking our biases and manifesting a perceived reality based on fear, facts, or fraud, informing perceptions, decision-making processes, and actions. Let me read it one more time, because I know that's a lot. Narratives evolve from taking our biases and manifesting perceived reality based on fear, facts, or fraud, informing perceptions, decision-making processes, and actions. Today, we're going to be spending some time breaking down this idea of narratives and breaking down this description. We'll spend some time pointing to some biblical passages and some narratives and some ways even that what the social reality at the time of Jesus and how that plays out into biases and narratives. And we'll try to respond in a way that represents Christ well. So let's start breaking it down this way. We'll start with this. Narratives evolve from taking our biases. We're going to start with that first word, biases, which I know is like a buzzword. Like I actually am doing some research for this. I was like, you know what? Who has some probably good just videos on bias? It's like, I bet TED Talk has like 2 or 3. So let's go to TED Talks on YouTube. And it's like hundreds of videos on bias. So if you want to know about bias in the workplace, bias with gender, bias in all of these different ways, just go watch TED Talks, and you will find hundreds of these. But psychology today gives a pretty succinct definition of bias. A bias is a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against something or someone. Neurologically, scientists state that what our biases actually are is they're mental shortcuts that our brain has created in order to help our brain work faster. Sometimes that's connected to safety. Sometimes it's just a shortcut to make life easier. In the Bible, bias is really all over the place if you read through it, because these are humans writing the story. These are humans interacting in these stories, telling these stories. So their perceptions and their interactions are all framed in this idea. Whether it be David, who's overlooked to face Goliath because he's too small, or Jonah, who has this disinterest from sharing about God to the Ninevites due to their racial difference, or maybe to the story of the Good Samaritan, which, if you aren't familiar with the Good Samaritan, it's entirely about bias. For those who may not know, Jesus tells this story about this man who is on this road, and he is beaten up and robbed and left for dead. He's left on the side of the road, just bloodied. Another person comes along. It's a priest who, in the ancient world, would have been viewed as very ethical and a person that should have values and compassion. And he sees him bloodied on the road, and he just keeps walking. And then a second person walks by, a Levite, another person who should have these ethics and these values. And the Levite sees him bloodied on the road, and he just keeps going. And when the people would have heard Jesus telling of this message, they would have thought immediately that, well, of course these two people should stop. One of them, at least. They're the good people. They're the ethical people. They should know that if someone is bleeding on the side of the road left for dead, we should stop and check on them. But instead, a third person walks by, a Samaritan, a bad person, someone whose descendants had defiled God. So surely they couldn't stop, and surely they couldn't have compassion. But the story goes that they do. And Jesus, telling this story, he challenges the biases of the listeners, because the listeners would have assumed, again, that the two good people surely stopped, and this one bad person would never stop. We all have these biases, right? If we are honest with ourselves, we all have them, each and every one of us. Some of them are good. Some of them are shortcuts for our brain to keep us safe, and other ones are not at all. Let me share a few with you that came to mind as I was just quickly thinking through some of these that I have. I have a bias that when I get off of 95 and I'm coming into the neighborhood, that the best way to go is the McComas Street exit, to do a U-turn and then to come into the neighborhood. Am I right? I have no clue, but I'm convinced that is the way I should go. Why? Because that's what I've done before, and I will continue to do. I have a bias that all basketball players are tall men. Now, I know that the WNBA exists, and one of my favorite basketball players of all times was this guy named Muggsy Bogues, who played in the 90s, and he was like 5'4". So I know that is also not true, but I have this bias that when I think of basketball players, that's what I think about. I have a bias that all music, all genres are so superior to country music. And if you like country music, I may have a bias against you, honestly. If we are at something and classical music comes on, fine with it. If hip-hop comes on, fine with it. Country music comes on, I will try to get you to change that immediately. I also have a bias. I think that, again, this is one I think that we all have if you're a sports fan. I have a bias against St. Louis Cardinal fans, Green Bay Packers fans. I grew up in Central Illinois. I was a fan of the Bulls. I was a fan of the Cubs, of the Bears. The Bulls didn't really have any rivals at that time because we just won everything. Since then, we've not. But the Cubs were the lovable losers, and here was the St. Louis Cardinals, who always were winning the division. I had a bias against them and a bias against their fans. We have thousands of biases that are just constantly playing out in our minds. So I want you to begin to consider that throughout today. What are some of the biases that you may have that are these barriers to you seeing people through the eyes of God, that are informing you making these narratives about maybe other people. Let's keep working through this description here. Narratives evolve from taking our biases and manifesting a perceived reality. Let's stop with this phrase, manifesting a perceived reality. If you spend much time with kids, which I have 4 little ones, it's really amazing to see their imagination at work. Like, I don't know if you've spent much time, but just seeing them in their natural environment where they can create these games, they can create these worlds, it amazes me. Like, my kids like to play this game sometimes in the car, that they are having this underwater adventure. And every car that goes by, or every street cone that they see is like a school of fish, and then here comes the semi, and the semi is this giant whale, and my wife and I are in the front, and we're like, thank goodness you're not bickering at one another, so whatever. But if you just listen for a second, it's amazing to see the way that their minds are constructing this world. But I'm also convinced that sometimes we convince ourselves as adults that we don't have this imagination. But I think we do. I just think that we've stopped living this underwater adventure, and instead we've started to create our own perceived realities. A world where everyone is out to get me. A world where no one can touch me because I'm in charge, I'm on top. A world where everything constantly goes wrong. Or how about this? While driving, everyone who's driving slow, they must be on their phone and they don't care about anyone. And everyone who's driving too fast or faster than me is reckless. Right? These perceived realities. Or in the workplace, there is no way that my coworkers care about this thing as much as I do. I've put in time and effort and they haven't. Or the opposite. My coworkers don't care about me as a person. They don't respect my boundaries. We create these realities in our minds, and oftentimes they're just exaggerations of what we are perceiving. They're exaggerations of what we have observed. In these imaginative realities, there's just a sliver of truth that grows in our minds like ivy into every nook and cranny. And sometimes we can manipulate data to further our own agendas in this way. Look no further than, your family member's Facebook post who lives far away, or your favorite source of information. Our brains are designed to help us survive. But if survival is what matters to our brains, truth is not always present. Like, we realize that, right? And the truth that is not always present, it's fair to say then that we are creating these own perceived realities. Again, sometimes for the sake of survival. When Jesus shows onto the scene, this is witnessed kind of in his situation. The religious at the time knew of these prophecies of this upcoming Messiah, this forthcoming person who they have begun to create these narratives about who this person should be, what they should look like, because of their social context. Because at the time, they were, a Jewish people that were being oppressed by the Roman Empire. They lived under the Roman Empire. And for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, they have continued to be that. It just changed whether it was the Greek Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Roman Empire. And so they conceive in their minds this idea that a powerful, militaristic man is going to come onto the scene. But then Jesus comes in the form of a baby. Not matching at all what they imagined based on the reality that they had constructed in their own mind about who the Messiah is. And what did the religious leaders then do when he doesn't match their reality? They push for punishment, death, crucifixion. He cannot be the Messiah because he doesn't fit into the box that I have created for him, my perceptions of who the Messiah should be. How many times do we shut other people down with the same logic? Because this is not how things should be. This is not how things work. This is not my lived experience. My perceived reality trumps whatever you have experienced or the way that you understand the world. But the question then becomes, where do these perceived realities come from? Because, as we mentioned, it's a sliver of this corroborating evidence that lead us here, right? Narratives evolve from taking our biases, manifesting a perceived reality based on fear, facts, or fraud. Fear, facts, or fraud. Most of the time, when we create these narratives, it can be this emotional response to information. It could be data that we have experienced. It could be, again, regardless of the data, because it's our perception. Or it could be a response stemming from some sort of deceit. Maybe that's deceit on the part of someone else, some fraud on the part of other people, or that is deceit that we have internalized in our mind, which, if you want more on that, go listen to Scott's message about insecurities. This may be an excellent place to start if you don't know what narratives you may be telling yourself, is to begin with the idea of fear. Where am I or have I experienced fear? What was my response to that fear? Why did I feel fear? How did this impact me moving forward? For example, something I've noticed over the years is that I've begun to have this increasing fear of heights, which is not something I've had my whole life. In fact, like in high school and middle school and whatnot, we would go on these trips to like amusement parks, and I'd be the person that's like exclusively riding roller coasters. But as I've gotten older, not due to any negative experience I've had, not due to any negative experience I've witnessed someone else have, but I have this anxiety in certain situations involving heights. My brain creates these ideas of fear connected to this, and probably something I should try to figure out, where does this stem from? Because I don't know. I just know that I have this fear that then creates this reality for me. The Jewish leaders at the time wanted so badly to believe that the Messiah would be this militaristic figure. Why? Because of fear. They lived under the oppression of the Roman Empire. Each and every day they didn't know what to expect from the oppressor. They wanted to experience a liberation rather than the constant fear of their social reality. The second thing that can help drive those perceived realities is facts, right? This can be connected to data. This can be connected to experiences. For example, a narrative that I believed when I was younger was I was not very smart. I did not get good grades as a kid. I did not like school. Actually, I hated school. And I remember hearing some different critiques of my teachers throughout the years. My second grade teacher telling me I had the worst handwriting she had ever seen. My 10th grade, this one's even better. My 10th grade English teacher wrote on one of my papers, "What language is this in? Clearly not English." So I was like, all right, guess 10th grade English teachers know how to roast people. My goodness. But these teachers are missing a key data point, which is that I'm dyslexic. So naturally, my writing skills, my reading skills, my language arts skills, my basic phonics skills are going to be impacted. And if you are not accounting for that data piece, you're going to interpret the data in a different way. Which that paragraph was pretty bad, just so we're clear. She wasn't wrong, just how she presented it was not very nice to the sophomore in high school. As I mentioned, the expectation of the Pharisees, one of the reasons why they believed that the Messiah would be this person, this militaristic hero, was because of the data they were working off of. This guy named Judas Maccabeus lived in the 2nd century BC, and he was a Jewish priest that turned war hero to help revolt against the Seleucid Empire, who was part of the Greek Empire. This Messiah-like figure colored the data in which the Pharisees began to interpret who the Messiah should be. And so they began to recapitulate this idea that the Messiah should look like Judas Maccabeus because he tried to save our people. And he partially did, but he didn't fully. This narrative was built on data, but one that was proved wrong by Christ. Finally, these narratives can come from fraud or deceit, misleading information. If we're not careful, we can accept claims as factual without critical thinking. Let me show you a few examples of these that I found that I think were really funny and interesting, right? So this first one that we'll put the picture up of was the 2012 presidential run. And on here, you'll see a pie chart talking about the 3 Republican candidates. And if you know anything about pie charts, they should add up to 100%. This pie chart adds up to 193%, which is impossible. But the data here is used to mislead people. Or how about this, the next one here? Did you know that dentists recommend these cigarette filters? I mean, it's from the 1950s. I don't think your dentist now would recommend them, but it is used to mislead people. Or this next one. This is a percentage of Americans that identify as Christians, right? And the purpose here is to show this huge decline. But if you look at the actual percentages, it goes from 77 to 65, right? But it looks like it's like 1/3 of the amount, but it's actually 12 percentage points less. Or how about this? Baltimore's best crab cake, right? Which we all just kind of laugh at and joke unless you're Buddy the Elf and then you take it seriously. But there's all these ways that we are facing this fraud and this deceit and this misleading information. Sometimes from other people, again, sometimes from ourselves. This is just the tip of the iceberg where misinformation is used to create narratives, to deepen prejudices, sometimes to oppress certain people. We see the Pharisees continuing to interact with Jesus, and this time towards the end of his ministry. Not their expectations, but what they now are doing with him. And they arrest Jesus, and they take him to go see Pilate, a Roman governor. And Pilate is like, why are you bringing this guy to me? Like, deal with him yourself. This is your problem. And the Pharisees respond this: if he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. Like, implying he in fact is a criminal and therefore he should deal with him. They use this deceitful language to spread the narrative that they wish to become popularized. The last part of this explanation, which we'll go a little bit quicker through because it's a little bit more digestible, is this. It says, narratives evolve from taking our biases, manifesting a perceived reality based on fear, facts, or fraud, informing our perceptions, decision-making processes, and actions. When we create these narratives and we tell ourselves these stories, they begin to leak out into our relationships. They begin to leak out into the world around us. They begin to leak out into things like policies even. That grimace on the other person's face becomes this personal attack against us. These narratives begin to just twist the reality. Because of these narratives, maybe I don't consider certain people when it comes to dating, or I don't consider certain people when it comes to voting, or I don't interact with certain people or go to certain establishments. Or how about because of these narratives we've created, we cross the street when we see someone coming, or we get into an argument with someone on social media because we get triggered. These narratives seep into the real world, and they have real life implications. They impact our relationships, and they impact the relationships that we have with people we don't even know. So let me ask you here, where have you created these unnecessary conflict due to a narrative that you or maybe someone else has created? Are there relationships in your life that you need to make amends with because you've created this reality and this narrative that has then seeped out into the relationship? These real-life outpourings of the narratives that we have constructed contradict the idea of God's image inside each one of us. When we do this, we deny others lived experience, and we force them into our own perception. We read scriptures like this: you are fearfully and wonderfully made. In Christ you have been brought to fullness. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. You are a child of God. You are a masterpiece. And we read those passages and we say, this applies to me, but not you. We apply them to ourselves and deny them to others. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus shares this parable that I think is apt to our conversation here. It says this in Luke 18. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, that is the key here, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. In this parable, which one do you want to be? The religious person who is looked at very favorably amongst society, and he approaches God, and he's doing so intending to tear someone else down in order to build himself up? Or the tax collector, a traitor to his own people, in cahoots with the Roman Empire, the oppressors, a person who stands far away and just is pleading there for mercy. The Pharisee allows the narratives to drive the perception of others, inferring that they need a little bit less of God's grace than the other person. Duke Kwan says this: it is impossible to love someone you disagree with when you secretly believe that they need Jesus more than you. And I think a lot of times we do that. We don't want to admit that, but we do that. So what do we do with these narratives? How do we begin to battle against these stories? First of all, it's important that we begin to have a radical honesty with ourselves. Where do I have biases? How am I creating these narratives? How are these narratives impacting the relationships that I have? And it's one thing to identify them mentally, but then it is imperative that we face it and we educate ourselves about the situation. Maybe this is to ask the other person that we have offended or we've created these narratives about to get together for coffee and to work out whatever the situation is. Or perhaps if it's more of a general bias towards a group of people, spending some time researching and learning about them. It's important sometimes even that we take some time and we just assess our life. There was this study that came out about 10 years ago. I think it was done by Pew Research. I could be wrong on that. But it was talking about white evangelicals. And it said that 75% of white evangelicals exclusively have white friends. So maybe there's some bias there. If everyone around me is this, if everyone looks like this, if everyone thinks like this, I'm going to create more and more narratives and more biases. If you're struggling to discover maybe some of the bias that you have, Google bias test, and there will be, the first link that will pop up is this thing from Harvard, allowing you to test your biases with different people. It'll allow you to do it when it comes to race, to gender, to weight, even to presidents. Who do you have bias towards there? Because again, when it comes to political stuff, like we want to act like we don't have biases. We totally do. Second, we must address the manifested realities, the ways that these have capitulated ideas into our minds. In what areas of your life have you fabricated narratives? Have you created alternative realities? And instead of creating realities, how about we aim to more fully understand what is actual reality? This may involve, again, asking the perspective of someone else rather than just assuming. It may also mean avoiding cherry-picking ideas or themes or using data for our own agenda. Remembering that our perspective is not the perspective, it is a perspective. There's a kid's book that my kids have that I think is really impactful when it comes to this. It's called A Tale of Two Beasts, and it's actually 2 books in one. And it tells the story of this girl who's going through the forest, and she finds this squirrel-like figure, and she's like, I'm going to take the squirrel home, and it's going to be my pet. And then it flips the script, and the second half of the book is about the perspective of the squirrel creature, saying, this beast captured me, and now have been taken into their household and forced to do all of these things. And it's a really hilarious book, but it teaches this idea that there are 2 characters here, and they both have very distinct perspectives on what is going on. Third, we can spend some time understanding the roots of the subject of our narratives. For some, it's important that we look first at ourselves. We spend some time in therapy. We unwind what wounds from childhood or events shaped us and who we are today. Others, this may mean sitting across the table from someone who is different than you or who you've created this narrative about, and just understanding their perspective or their life, where then we can develop a more well-rounded understanding of who they are, a more well-rounded idea of the data involved, if you will. And lastly, we must make amends. When we talk about interpersonal relationships and narratives, this may mean getting face-to-face with the other person, owning the narratives that we have forced onto this other person. Sometimes confessing that to the other person is really important. It's an important first step. Of course, we can choose to run and hide, but all that does is it just further develops this plot of the narrative. And for groups, maybe making amends means seeking out how to bring change as you now understand the roots of the other's story. Let me give you an example of this. Let's take, for example, the hip-hop artist Notorious B.I.G., Biggie, which I'm sure everyone knows, or you've maybe heard his songs. And if you hear his singles from the 90s, he put out one album while he was alive. It purports these ideas of gang life and womanizing and chauvinism and aspirations towards this elite status. And we can create all kinds of narratives from this about who he is and what that says about other folks. But when we begin to question our manifested realities, we can begin to see that these are songs that are part of an album, and also on this album are songs called Ready to Die and Suicidal Thoughts. As we see the whole of the album, the whole situation, we can begin to unwind the narratives that we have formulated in our minds, and we can begin to ask ourselves the question, what in his life led to these musical expressions? Well, clearly, the impact of poverty, hopelessness, as one author writes, a depression masquerading as machismo. We can choose to stand on the sidelines and we can say, thank God I'm not like Biggie. Thank God I'm not doing the things that he's doing. Or instead we can find ourselves humbled, pounding on our chest saying, God, have mercy on me, I'm a sinner. And then we can begin to seek changes to the realities of those things, such as poverty, hopelessness, depression. We can begin to ask the question of how I can seek to help others who may have been impacted in the same way. And in doing this, we stop crafting these narratives. And instead, we ask God to have mercy on us as sinners. Each week in this series, one of the things that we have been doing is taking a little bit of time to just reflect on these ideas. And we're going to continue that today. And so over the next couple minutes, I invite you to watch this video and take some time to be silent and just reflect on the words.
Let's take a moment to reflect on narrative. What is a false narrative you have believed about someone else? Where do you see bias in your life? For the next minute, share these narratives and bias with God. Ask God to expose any narratives or biases you are holding on to. Ask God to reveal a person you have believed a false narrative about.
Each week here at the Foundry, we take some time to show our hope that we have in Jesus and what Jesus has done. A hope that lives beyond some of these narratives, these biases, these things that we have created in our minds. A hope that reminds us of who we are and who other people are as well. So in just a second, I'm going to pray, and then after I finish praying, I'm going to invite you to come to the front of the room or the back of the room to grab communion. And as you partake, to take a moment and just continue to reflect on some of those questions and continue to remind yourself of the unifying force of God and the hope that we have in Jesus. Will you pray with me? God, I know how difficult it can be sometimes to hear hard things and to hear hard messages, to not want to look ourselves in the face and to see ways in which we have just denied those around us, those relationships that we have, or those other people, denying them your love, your acceptance, denying them that they have become a royal priesthood, and that they are your children as well. God, help us unite under communion and unite in a way where we can begin to face these narratives, where we can see who we need to make amends with, because we know that you have made amends, and that you love us, each and every one of us. Help us to remember today to see you when we look into the eyes of others, and to remember the sacrifice that you paid for us, yes, God, for us, but also for that other person. It's in your Son's name that we celebrate this. Amen.